Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Simon Fraser University panel, Connecting and Building the Science Innovation Ecosystem. I'm Sarah Lubick, SFU's Director of Entrepreneurship, a former innovation leader for the Government of Canada, and a tech and science entrepreneur myself. So I'm very excited about this panel. Not to even begin speaking about how excited I am to talk with the panelists we have today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and it's particularly important for us to acknowledge at an event on innovation, because we know that the history of human innovation is also the history of consequences that are planned or unplanned, and as we drive change, we need to be mindful of the consequences of our actions and to take a future-focused and holistic approach to innovation. So thank you for joining us today. And a huge thank you to our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. But before I introduce our incredible panel, it's important to talk about what is our collective why and the power of science-based innovation, as well as the challenges that we're facing to unlock that power. Our world is facing no shortage of massive challenges. And how to transition in the energy sector, how to clean up oceans, how to survive pandemics and the computational power we need for drug discovery and other fundamental questions requires massive investment in and then translation of great science into impact. New batteries for sustainable power require new materials. Personalized medicine could drastically increase and improve health outcomes, chemical-free pest management, and on and on and on. Imagine a world where we've unlocked all of that potential. But there are still many steps that we need to take. So let us know in the poll on the screen what sectors you're representing, and that will help us know where you want to see change and where you want to drive innovation. So it's important to remember that it isn't just, as if that wasn't enough, about saving the world that's important for science innovation, but there's also a significant economic argument for investing in more science-based ventures. Research has shown that these companies, if properly set up and supported, which is foreshadowing for the future discussion, actually have a better survival rate than your average startup. They also tend to stay close to the research where they were founded, and so continue to advance science, and they don't leave. So stem cell technologies was started out of UBC by a professor who wanted better jobs for his students, and it's become Canada's biggest biotech company. These also become anchor tenants and job creators. Nanotech Security and Ionomer came out of SFU, both materials spinouts, and they've remained engaged to the science base that they came out of, which means there's another reason not to leave. And they also offer solutions to recovery. So I'm guessing most of the people here have heard of AbCellera, which is a spin out of UBC and was instrumental in creating solutions to the pandemic. So economic arguments, save the world arguments. This is why we need science-based research. However, there's a number of challenges. Before we get to great outcomes, we need to navigate all the challenges that come with them. And so even before the valley of death, which is what most people think about when they think of companies that don't succeed, the inability to get into the further market, we have something I like to call the valley of never having lived, which is fantastic ideas and fantastic research that didn't have the appropriate conditions set up for it to succeed. And it's very important to note, and we'll talk about soon, that the conditions for success for a science-based startup often start in pre-commercial stages, in the lab, in the university. And so those things need to be addressed. It's also important to realize, for any entrepreneur in here, it's important to understand the personas that are involved in these kind of innovations. So the people who drive innovations in the science-based ventures may not at first glance look like who you think of when you think of an entrepreneur. A lot of research talks up the star scientist who commercializes their research, but in a lot of Canadian institutions, the measurements of success don't line up with driving a company. However, their grad students and postdocs could well be the solution if they were aware of the opportunities that were open to them, but we don't usually set them up with that awareness. It's another topic for the conversation. And then there's also special conditions to science-based research. With fantastic opportunity often comes challenges. And so it's important to realize that science-based companies can often require far more resources and also longer timelines than companies without science and tech uncertainty, which requires different perspectives from investors and also supporters like incubators. And there are also significant investments of alignment. So this diagram shows all of the different players that are involved in commercialization of a science-based venture, from the university and the science base to funders, government sources, different kinds of investors, people who produce complementary products, all of the intermediaries down to the final customer. And all of these need to be understood and lined up and worked with in order to create the conditions for science-based value creation. And so I'm delighted to get to introduce panelists that are going to allow us to get to know what we can do to better connect the science innovation ecosystem. And they represent players from across the ecosystem. So we have with us Alejandro Adam, who is the president of NSERC, Dr. Kauser Samli, who is a scientist, an entrepreneur, and an executive. We have Dr. Alicia Main, who is from Simon Fraser University, who is a professor in entrepreneurship and innovation, also an academic director of the Eye-to-Eye program, which solves many of these issues, and the special director or special advisor to the BPR on innovation. Duncan Stewart from the Business Development Bank of Canada, who's a partner in their Deep Tech Venture Fund. And so with that, there's only one more person, sorry about that. So one more person that we have to introduce. So we're also joined today by Kristen Elkbo, a graphic facilitator from Drawing Change. This conversation will be graphically recorded, which means you will see our dialogue and ideas drawn in real time. So what I'm going to start with is asking each of our panelists to give an introduction to themselves and what they're working on. And then we're going to have a facilitated discussion followed by Q&A, and then we'll see what Kristen has drawn, and we will wrap up. So with that, Alejandro, can I ask you to introduce yourself first, please? And we'll get started.
With pleasure. Thank you very much, Sarah. So my name is Alejandro Adam. I am president of NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. I was formerly CEO and scientific director of MITAX, and I am a professor of mathematics at the University of British Columbia. And I guess what I'm working on right now is running NSERC and making sure that all the great science and engineering done in Canada is mobilized for the benefit of society. Looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. And next on my screen, I have Kauser.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for bringing us together, Sarah. My name is Kauser Samli. As a scientist entrepreneur, I've been involved in academic industry ecosystem development with stakeholders at the government and regulatory level as well. One of the things that I'm really involved in right now is ecosystem building, but across stakeholders, and particularly in the province of British Columbia. I'm on the board of Genome British Columbia. I also work with Innovate BC and Creative Destruction Labs and serve on the faculty at Singularity University.
Fantastic. And Alicia.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted to be on this panel that's near and dear to my heart, and with colleagues that I respect very highly. I'm an innovation and entrepreneurship professor with a focus in science innovation. I've worked in this space for 25 years, if you include my graduate research. And I'm the founder of a program, the Invention to Innovation program, which is also in partnership with MITAX, the MITAX Eye-to-Eye skills training program that is trying to build entrepreneurial mindset in scientists and engineers who can be helpful in this science innovation ecosystem, both strengthening the ecosystem in various ways and also being able to have more exciting careers for themselves in leading innovation and seeing impact from their research. I also, as you mentioned, have a role across SFU embedded within our Vice President Research and Innovation Office as the leader and champion of SFU's pan-university innovation strategy, SFU Innovates. And I'm delighted to talk further about how we can further build our science innovation ecosystem in Canada, with a particular focus for me on, instead of scaling up existing companies, also thinking of how we can build for scale from the outset, a portfolio of companies coming out of our universities to address pressing global challenges.
I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Before that, I also want to introduce Duncan. So do you want to give us a little bit of background on what you're up to?
Sarah, thanks so much. Yes, great pleasure to be with you. I guess I would describe myself maybe trained as a physicist and an engineer and an inventor. I went to school in Toronto and then Stanford, California, 10 years at Hewlett-Packard's Central Research Lab in the Quantum Science Lab. Then came back to Canada and spent 10 years running part of the Canadian National Lab, the National Research Council of Canada, and the quantum physics and quantum chemistry team there. And then after interacting more and more with entrepreneurs and looking at the problem or the challenge or the issue of how does Canada take this excellent science that we are so good at doing and creating and turn that more and more into technology, then I sloped over towards the entrepreneurial side of the world. Have 2 years been at the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is the largest venture capital investor in the country, and had the pleasure to join the newly launched BDC Deep Tech Venture Fund as an investment partner 6 months ago. So that's what I'm up to right now. That's a $200 million fund. It was created explicitly to invest in Canadian science-based ventures that are building off of Canada's research excellence and trying to turn it into technology. And I guess that really addresses my core passion and belief that we're actually entering a new age of innovation. And that's an age of innovation which is mission-oriented public interest. And Sarah, as you mentioned, it's not that we don't have enough problems in the world. We have lots and lots of problems. We can solve those sometimes through regulation. And there's a big piece of this conference that actually addresses that topic very, very thoughtfully. And we can sometimes solve those through innovation. And that's where I guess my own passion is. How do we invent our way out of the problems that we have, that we've created? And I guess my belief is that although Canada didn't do super well in the 20th century in terms of innovation standing in the world, we didn't do poorly, but we didn't emerge super well. I believe that some of those games are being reset. It's almost like you get to play the game again because the new science advances have disrupted the field. So I believe in that new spirit of global problems, that Canada's deep science capacity and its entrepreneurial and I want to say caring spirit can actually help lead that new age of public interest innovation.
I have so many things that I want to add on that, but I can see that the smiling and nodding along with the panelists suggests they also want to comment on that. So why don't we get this panel started? Thank you so much. And start talking about, Canadian innovation sector. And I'll start by drawing on something that you said, Duncan, which was that we didn't do so well. Not badly, but we could do a lot better as far as innovation goes. And specifically thinking about private sector investment in R&D. So at our pre-call, we talked about all these different challenges with how the private sector interacts with science-based innovation. So Alicia, do you want to start by commenting on some attitudes that might need to change or things that we can do to change? And then I'll make sure to encourage the other panelists. This is supposed to be a conversation, not just going down the panel asking whatever I throw at you. So do feel free to add on and respectfully challenge your colleagues as we go.
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for kicking off some of that thinking, Duncan. So I would say that one of the reasons we've had such a poor record, relatively speaking, to our potential in innovation, the perception of risk and uncertainty by the leaders of companies in Canada and culturally. There was a great survey that was done. We could use another one. It was done in about 2012 or so by Industry Canada that looked at the major barriers to innovation in Canada. And they polled 5,000 leaders of companies that were 20 people or more, the CEOs, and they picked overwhelmingly risk and uncertainty which is kind of ironic when you think that uncertainty is where opportunity lies. And to Duncan's point, there is a chance to have a second go at that with a number of major changes, including the clean energy transition and quantum as an example. And we certainly saw that as well in the pandemic, how well the research in our universities actually could be mobilized to respond to a pressing global challenge. I'll say one other thing about what we haven't done well and what we could try to change, which has been, if you look at the metrics, the report cards that Canada's had on innovation over the last decades, one metric that we really don't do well on, and I think it's an important metric, it's a proxy for science-based ventures. So we found a lot of companies who do very well in founding new ventures, but when you look at science-based, defined as those that are patenting in the first 5 years after formation, we get a D compared to our comparator countries. We really don't have enough ventures founding that are patenting before and in the first 5 years after founding. And so I think that points to a challenge that we've had of getting some of our best invention out of universities and out into the world. We're certainly doing it, but I would say that we're not doing it enough.
That's fair. I can see everyone nodding along, but Duggan, you were nodding the hardest. And I suggest, I also think that pointed to a possible challenge in absorptive capacity and also in culture. So do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I had the advantage of spending about 15 years in Silicon Valley, and there's this idea that Silicon Valley is this magical place, and there is a, I think in some cases, intentionally propagated myth that every invention in Silicon Valley comes out of a garage. And in the case of Hewlett Packard, you can actually go to downtown Palo Alto and you can visit the garage where Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard baked the enamel onto their first oscilloscopes using the family oven. But it's actually a myth. And Hewlett Packard as a company would not exist without a massive engagement with the public government of the day. And just that was at the time when the Second World War was happening. There was a huge connection between technology and public interest in that case. The U.S. took a particular road there, but that road really drove the 20th century of innovation. And the myth that all of that innovation happened in a garage is actually a myth. Without that public engagement, without the longer term public interest and also money, HP would not exist as the company that it is today, neither would IBM. And in fact, when I was working at HP in their advanced research lab, HP was about a $100 billion company at that time. That advanced research lab, if you can believe it, was 50% funded through contracts, many of them DARPA contracts. So you have one of the largest companies on the planet, and the advanced research, which to Alicia's point, is too risky even for that company. That risk is mitigated when you bring in the longer term public interest, which in the US case is often interpreted through a defense and security lens. It doesn't have to be. My conjecture is the 21st century is going to be interpreted through a sustainability lens, not just a defense and security lens. But it's that combination of the long-term public interest and, as Alicia commented, the ability of the private sector to actually innovate. And that's something that the US understands intuitively. And Sarah, to your point, in the Canadian culture, we're not as familiar with that.
I love that. And I love any conversation that talks about debunking myths around innovation. And I'm wondering if Kels or Alejandro, there were any other myths that while we were on the topic of challenges that we're holding dear that we should maybe debunk. Oh, Kelsey, you're on mute. It had to happen sometime.
There we go. So yes, challenges, and I think Duncan and Alicia really touched on this, is around culture and the myths around it. We don't need to reinvent the system. there are plenty of examples of ecosystems where this is being done really well. Duncan pointed out a couple of them already. And so being able to learn from those, integrate and adapt and refine them as we implement them in our local regions and provinces across Canada becomes increasingly crucial in being able to do that. And culture change is a big part of that, both starting from the ecosystem stakeholders within academia, within the private sector, especially funding bodies, and of course, the long-term public interest that provincial governments, local governments, and federal governments embody and carry the mandate for. And so being able to work across all those ecosystems to create the type of innovation hub that really is built on these pillars, it becomes so crucial. Another program similar to some of the ones that Duncan mentioned that in the United States is very popular is the SBIR STTR funding mechanism. It really does allow very effectively for startup companies, science-based companies, to be able to tap into funding that is driven from a long-term public interest and allows them to get to maturity and close that gap. I'll pause there and would welcome additional thoughts, particularly Alejandro, if you'd like to add.
For sure. I think the myth that I want to burst is that our universities aren't innovative or that Canadians aren't risk takers. Actually, we are, and our universities are some of the finest in the world. However, and Duncan was relating his experiences in Silicon Valley. There has to be a path. There has to be a mechanism where a student, a professor, or someone in the university can see the importance of taking risk to mobilize their research. And that's where the pull of in the case of the US, it was the defense establishment, competition worldwide. Now, as has been mentioned, perhaps sustainability or health. That impetus is important, and the government has an important role to play in creating that pathway and that feeling that what you invented as a scientist will have a repercussion on society and on your own well-being. So I think we definitely could do much better on that. And I think that's why we're discussing here. Now, I remember I actually taught at Stanford for a few years, and I remember teaching some remote courses in linear algebra to people at Lockheed. And the students were just so motivated, and primed for well-paying jobs in the area. So there's a lot of personal interest also in seeing how they can mobilize the knowledge and the entrepreneurial knowledge also. Remember the partnership between the engineering school and the business school at Stanford also was very important in training the entrepreneur engineer, which we were very proud of. So I think we can do it, but we have to create that path in the unique Canadian way.
Well, that is incredible segue, and also several amazing points. Considering we're talking about changing the pathways of scientists, Alicia, given your experience with Eye2Eye and the other programs that we work with at SFU, do you want to comment on how we go about doing that culture and mindset change and what you found while you've been doing this program?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you. So I wanted to talk about a little bit to that point about what we've found with the development of the Eye2Eye program, and in particular the MyTax Eye2Eye that has just gone national across the country, is that we found that within a short period of time, 7 months with the MyTax Eye2Eye, we can make a really strong change, a transformative change actually, in the mindset of very talented scientists and engineers who are, to Alejandro's point, some of the leading inventors in the world. We do very well in invention statistics. And this is true for our professors as well as for our postdocs and our PhD students, that we have this incredibly valuable resource. And so we found that by just giving a lens and working experientially with the invention in the research lab of these scientists and engineers, that we can start the path to them becoming far more valuable to the science innovation ecosystem and having more fulfilling careers themselves, in that they are better able to create impact from their research, be that through starting a venture that may never have started before. That's in an important area for social and economic value creation, or be that through becoming a bridge from industry back to university research labs and being trusted to lead innovation in industry, in effect, building the receptor capacity in our innovation ecosystem. Or finally, if you do go on to academia as a PhD student or postdoc, being able to be successful in setting up your research experiments and gaining translational research grants, but also in what you choose to focus your own time on and that of your lab in order to have the maximum impact. So I would say that we have found that the research both lead us to believe that entrepreneurial capabilities can be taught as well as mentored, and that we're seeing the impact that those HQP can have on the innovation ecosystem with that sort of experience. And to the points that Duncan made earlier, that and other aspects that could help build our science innovation ecosystem further do require a mission orientation and do require an important role from the entrepreneurial state or government.
I think that's so important. And if I can reframe that as the myth busting that we were doing earlier, the looking at a scientist and thinking that's not an entrepreneur, that person doesn't necessarily have the conditions or the personality of an entrepreneur, is such a waste, because we have such amazing people who are entirely capable of translating things if you give them the right tools and show them the right pathways. So I wanted to throw that back for a moment to Alejandro, because at our earlier talk, we talked about the culture within labs and what they look like right now and how they need to change. And so I wondered if I could ask you to comment on that.
Sure, yes. I think scientists are very entrepreneurial within their domains, right? The great ideas and how you do breakthroughs within. But the idea that you can do this in the quote unquote real world, that's where this incentivization and the ramping and the creating of bridges that can accomplish it. Too often one finds that at universities, there is no direct incentive to working with the outside world or being entrepreneurial. If you work in some of these areas which are not, say, in the obvious, very applied engineering or very applied health sciences, then you don't even get a whiff of the possibilities that are out there. And that was one of the motivations for creating the MyTex programs, the internships, and this other program that Alicia and her colleagues have developed so wonderfully, is to create that momentum within academia so that even folks in very deep theoretical sciences can understand that what they are working on, what they're talking about, has implications in society. And if they don't know it, their students will sure know it. Because I don't know any student that doesn't get excited when you tell them, hey, your research will cure this, your research will do that. But just let the student have some experiential learning. Let the student take one of these courses that Alicia and folks are doing in entrepreneurship, and you can unleash that. So it goes back to some very basic incentivization, some silos, interdisciplinary. We find it's difficult. See, like I, who work in the math department, rarely talk to people, say, in the physics department. So that's kind of amazing for people who aren't in universities. I have written papers with physicists. I'm happy to say that I've gone that far, and through a student who spoke both languages. So that's where the young people are key. And Alicia was absolutely right. They can create the bridges and that perhaps their elders don't fully understand, and bring people forward. So I think there's a lot that we can do institutionally to move this forward.
Absolutely.
Sarah, can I pick up on that for a second? There's this in that relationship between the science, the fundamental science that is happening, and then the creation of some sort of idea which will become intellectual property and will have value. and then the translation of that into a startup, there's this chasm that needs to be crossed, which is how does that idea exit from the university into the startup company? And I think we have yet another myth that technology transfer offices are actually revenue positive for the university system. And it turns out that the last time I looked, there were 6 across all of North America that were revenue positive. And every one of those had a single blockbuster patent of one kind or another, usually pharma. So we have this idea that pharma model can be applied to everything. And in fact, when we talk about deep science-based inventions and startups, it's almost orthogonal to what has to happen for the success of those science-based startups. Because as Alejandro mentioned, as Kauser mentioned, those science-based startups are deeply connected to the research, not only the foundation of the research, but the ongoing research. The standard pharma model of technology transfer licensing is, extract money, get the patents paid for, extract a royalty stream, and get some cash up front as we transfer this knowledge out of the university, because it's worth a hell of a lot and the people receiving it have deep pockets. In the case of a deep science startup, every one of those assumptions is actually wrong. The startup has no money. The last thing they want to do is give away a little bit of money to the university. And by making it an exit path from the university, you're trying to actively sever the connection, which is actually going to be most helpful to the startup as it continues to grow, meaning access to labs, access to the talent coming out of, for example, a particular research group or a particular department, as Alejandro mentioned, and the continued access and perhaps additional intellectual property that gets created by that world-leading research group. So we are seeing a little bit of a sea change here, and I think it's another opportunity, as Kauser mentioned, for a bit of a shift in culture. We don't have to rebuild it, just look at it from a different perspective. And of course, the goal is to align the long-term interests of the university and the startup, not their short-term interests, which can be at times look like they're heading in different directions. So the way to align that is actually very, very simple. Instead of getting cash from the startup, if the university starts thinking about taking a small equity position in the startup, then the subsequent growth of the startup adds value to the startup and the university. And they're incentivized to actually stick together rather than split apart. Of course, there are conflicts of interest that need to be thought about carefully. The negotiation has to be handled well, but that fundamental principle is now starting to happen. MIT and Harvard are investing in companies coming out of their own labs. And that's a change in behavior. I think that sort of thinking, we're starting to see it, that sort of thinking can go a long way, particularly in this deep science area, to really strengthening the connection between our excellent academic system and all those startups. And it sort of counters the disincentive and the risk-taking that Alicia mentioned, where in order to get the intellectual property out, somebody needs to take a really big risk, either on the part of the technology transfer office or on the part of the faculty or the postdoc, and navigate this uphill battle, which isn't aligned with the short-term needs of the startup. So that is a change that's happening. I'm really quite enthusiastic about it, and particularly in this deep science, deep tech area, I think it really could make a very big difference.
I think you're absolutely right. And speaking of people who've really been on that journey, Kauser, did you want to comment on what we see, where you see realignment needing to be done?
I think, Duncan, you made some excellent points here. One of the areas that I think, in my own journey as a scientist entrepreneur, one of the things that was incredibly helpful was having the high level leadership commitment within the academic environment to focus on innovation, to focus on applied research, high bar research, and to create a evolving and efficient pathway for commercialization. And this was, for example, some of the work done at the University of Georgia and the innovation gateway that they built to do all this, from inception of the idea to providing training to postdocs and faculty members, starting at the undergraduate level, to really do a grassroots effort to build up this culture of entrepreneurship, and to create a pathway for people to be successful. Because most of the time, folks coming out within academia historically don't have the background. And so this type of crucial investment is absolutely pays off. And we're Elisa and Sarah at SFU, the I2I program, the similarly named program, Alejandro, that you've been involved in, and other universities that are doing this, those types of programs are absolutely crucial to enabling the successful outcomes with long-term alignment that Duncan just talked about.
Alejandro, considering you were called, and Elisa, you were both called out by name in the particular by Kauser. So do you want to comment? Elisa, I saw you get part with your comment there.
I'll say that when someone said that we don't have to replicate what happened in the 20th century, right? So we have a way forward. And here we're talking about deep science and high tech sort of thing. So quantum is an example, I think, where we could hopefully get that right. And one of the key things about quantum is that the high level research keeps feeding back to the development of the products and the technology. So it's not like somebody creates a black box and then that's it, they're done, go home, and then the MBAs take over. No, it's sort of like it keeps on feeding back in. So you have to feed the training and the very high level quantum science. As I like to joke, there's even people working on cohomology in the quantum world. That's one of my areas of very pure mathematics. So it really goes to a very deep level of knowledge, and it's a whole quantum subject. But at the same time, quantum technologies, those are the things which folks around the world are interested in, very concrete devices. The quantum computing approach towards that is, of course, also extremely interesting. But I think that's where what the sort of mechanisms we're talking about, if we get this right, and signs are kind of promising in terms of the investments and the alignments, Canada can cash in on its dominance in an area which used to be within physics. It wasn't necessarily the super mainstream. So I think that's very exciting, and the fact that when Duncan talks about the getting the venture capital involved in this in a big way, and that's another point which we should make, of course. Money, there has to be a good investment. There has to be an amount of funding that will have an impact in the worldwide stage, and that's another one of the issues that I think our ecosystem faces. But again, I'm all for kind of resetting and creating this within the Canadian system, a model that will accomplish what we're talking about.
And I'd love to build on that. So to the point about quantum and the potential for reset and for a leading role in our ecosystem at SFU Innovates, we have a great example of that. So Photonic is a spin out of CRC chair Professor Stephanie Simmons' lab. She's a physics professor, and she had Canadian Foundation of Innovation, was a big supporter of the research lab that she built at SFU. And also there's been support there from the university ecosystem. But in return, to the point that Duncan, that you made, this is an ongoing relationship. The spin out of that out of the university, closely with the university, with the facilities that are within the university ecosystem and within the original PI's lab that has this CFI investment of, it's a $20 million facility. And so there's a symbiotic relationship as they grow, and the likelihood to have value creation and capture, co-located to our universities. We also at SFU have the host the Quantum Algorithms Institute. So a chance to really help build an ecosystem in that emerging area. I would say, to the points that have been made here, that and to the point, Duncan, that you made about only 6 technology transfer, technology licensing offices in North America actually being revenue positive, and those being positive because they were profitable, and those being profitable because of a individual outlier patent that won the pharmaceutical sweepstakes, that we need to think about our technology licensing offices and our IP supports for this science innovation ecosystem as being something we invest in. And I think we don't want the incentives to have short-term value capture or value maximization on licensing revenues. We want to think about the whole enterprise, about our whole science and research ecosystem, and how to try to unlock value, especially in deep tech areas, in areas that have potential for big social and economic value creation, and for innovation in Canada. So I think we need to look at an ecosystem level, and then we need to see where are the bottlenecks and where could we put programs that help this invention to innovation journey of the technology and of the HQP. Is it in helping to de-risk these inventions as they try to scale up the processes and productions? Is it in utilizing our core facilities for those? Is it in IP vouchers or better resourcing the ability of universities to make early stage IP bets on their PIs and on their research? Or is it in supporting our PhD students and then postdocs with commercialization postdoc funding that allows them to de-risk what they developed in their PhD in some sort of a lower risk environment? So those are some thoughts to add to the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I want to jump in there because and echoing some of what Kauser said on exactly that theme, Alicia, the NSERC programs that Alejandro runs, the I2I program, the Alliance program, those are in exactly the right space to help fuel this translation. They're typically in sort of $100,000 chunks, which is exactly the right amount for a postdoc for 1 year with some tools to go back and forth. One idea is from a venture capital perspective, a single student for 1 year does not Rome build, and what we need there is actually a larger commitment, thinking about how do we scale up some of those programs. It's not to say that academe, as founded in ancient Greece, is not doing the right thing to uncover the fundamentals of knowledge. That activity, as Alejandro said, Canada is actually exceptionally good at, and that is the foundation on which everything is built. From my perspective, in that venture capital translation, we need some more of these building blocks that help bridge that translation, and we need those building blocks to actually be a little bigger. And that's particularly true in the deep science space. And I see there was a question from the audience from Margaret Sawatsky, who talked about, if it looks like it's high risk and it takes longer, then how do we do that? If there are a couple more of these building blocks that help you take those steps in slightly bigger pieces than just one student for 1 year, that can go a very long way. And on the culture piece that Kauser talked about, and Alejandro would observe this as well, at Stanford in Silicon Valley, it was not unusual for a faculty member to take a leave of absence for 1 year or for 2 years if there was a super attractive startup opportunity. Now, of course, it was the culture there to follow the startup and do the translation. There are not that many academic faculty members in Canada who are currently in the habit of taking those leaves of absence. That is something that we could encourage going forward. And once again, from the venture capital perspective, it's absolutely critical that in these deep science ventures, that there be that faculty member or somebody serving as a truly deep science expert attached to the startup. I will say at the same time that if a faculty member takes a leave of absence, goes with the startup, at some point a choice needs to be made. That, again, from the VC perspective, it is very difficult to be both a faculty member and the founder or CEO of a startup. That's possible for a short time only, but the continued engagement at some level is absolutely critical.
Absolutely. Now, Alejandro, you just sat forward. So did you want to build on that?
Maybe Kauser would like to say a few words.
Sure, thank you. We have an opportunity here, and I think we're poised in a very unique window of opportunity, so to speak. We have a growing recognition and a lot of success already in this space, where academia, industry, venture capital, private equity are coming together. And I think to achieve the kind of critical mass to hit this next inflection point of ecosystem growth, we need greater concentrated collaboration and coordination. And I think there's a role for the provincial governments here to play that I think there already are in many ways. Building cohesive strategies for building innovation economies across specific industries, we need more of that. The recent biomanufacturing strategy work that was announced and that is continuing to move forward, that is crucial. It is absolutely crucial. Investments on building those types of strategy with input from across stakeholders are the kinds of initiatives that will allow us to think about big picture and begin to act on them even more so to achieve continued critical mass and hit those inflection points for growth. And when we do these things, we need to continue to be thinking about how do we bring in not just manufacturing jobs, but how do we bring in R&D jobs? How do we bring in corporate teams, corporate offices? Because you need to create the kind of workforce environment that allows people to be able to grow professionally and be able to jump back and forth or have go in a different direction than what they envisioned. We're already doing a lot of this, and I think the biomanufacturing strategy that was recently announced is a key step in the right direction as well. And we need to do more of this, is what I'm really advocating for. And at the same time, this should not be at the expense of basic fundamental research. We absolutely need that. It serves a critical purpose for the public. And I'm specifically highlighting this because I see there's a question about this in the Q&A chat, that there continues to be a crucial role for basic fundamental research to lay down the foundation, not just for science-based tech entrepreneurship, but also for public service to maintain that long-term focus that is in the public interest.
Kazi, can I ask a follow-up question on that? And I'm looking at the question from Dr. Kinder as well. So how does that fit into your view, your local view? How can, for example, a local region like a province take one of their public problems and use it to stimulate this?
Question. So I'll use an example. Recently, British Columbia launched a pilot innovation fund program. And that fund is that program is very specifically designed to solve very specific problems, they're very application oriented. And this particular program at Genome British Columbia grew out of feedback from a lot of the stakeholders, where there's a specific need for early stage startups to be able to get funding that is still very heavily R&D, but it is very focused on the application, creating enabling applications. I think we have a skeletal framework of technology readiness levels that has been really useful across the ecosystem. And being able to refine that into specific application development and enablement and solving key problems that through a commercialization pathway becomes absolutely crucial. So I mentioned that as an example of how this can be done and is being done. And that particular program is one example. There are others also in the ecosystem, other stakeholders who are rolling out programs across other provinces as well, and other organizations even within British Columbia.
Now, I want to call on Alicia for a moment, because I know you're a big fan of that program. And also, one of the things that's unique about it doesn't require the same industry match as a number of the other programs that are out there to aid innovation. So do you mind commenting on that a bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I would definitely. When I saw that particular innovation program from Genome BC announced, I was very happy that it was of a size if I recall correctly, it's $250,000 for a year. And it is also non-match, which for these type of ventures, these science-based ventures we're talking about, or the deep tech ventures, is really critical as a first stage. I note the NSERC Eye-to-Eye program, which we talked about earlier, and which, Duncan, that you endorsed its important role and wished for more of. I would agree that I think it's a fabulous program. I've seen an NSERC Eye-to-Eye aligned with most of the ventures that the science-based ventures that have made it out. And it's played an important role also in allowing, it's one of the very few programs in Canada that allows IP to be claimed as an eligible expense. And that's true both on the Tri-Council side as well as on the scale-up innovation side. So, NRC IRAP right now doesn't allow IP as an eligible expense, neither does SDTC. And I think personally that that's a mistake, that IP is, however we want to handle it, that some way we need to take away that barrier from our science-based ventures and from the scientist entrepreneurs that we want to enable. So, but I do think that we have a number, those are very good programs. Here in BC, the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research also has an I2C grant that is the first 2 years don't have to have a match. And I think that's really important for that initial stage until there's been company collaborators who can see the value of that research enough to be able to be a match. And it's not that the research isn't valuable, it's that often these are opportunity creations that are created by breakthrough new technologies, and the too. So instead of being derided as technology push, I think we need to see some of that as being exploring technology market matching and exploring how best to get some of these inventions out to the eventual impact that they can make, but being systematic in how we support this commercialization strategy and this commercialization journey.
I like that. I think I've started to say it's not technology push so much as driven mission and pull. So being able to go through those different stages. Now, I feel like there's investor point of view that goes along with this. Duncan, can I ask you to comment on those steps?
Absolutely. And looking at some of the, building off Kauser's comment on the regional innovation incentives, looking at some of the federal level innovation incentives, including SDTC, including the IDEAS program from the Department of Defense, which is modeled to some degree on the US DARPA program, and including the Innovative Solutions Canada, which is modeled quite closely actually on the SBIR program that Kauser mentioned. These are all ways for non-dilutive funding to flow into a startup, which if I think for a deep science startup, as an investor, you're always we're in Canada, so we have to use a Canadian analogy. You're always looking for the hockey stick and for the turnip at the end. But for a deep science startup, that flat part of the hockey stick can actually be kind of long, and it can take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of money. And at the same time, the startup is building value, mostly sort of latent value in the intellectual property that they're building and in the technology progress up the TRL scale as they make that technology more mature, as they find product market fit before they turn up here. But during that long, flat part of the hockey stick, the startup has to be supported somehow. And there are sort of two types of non-dilutive funding. One is more like a grant, and the other one is more like a contract. And Canada does a pretty good job of both of those. There was a comment from Dr. Kinder earlier about SHRED versus some of these other mechanisms, the direct, indirect versus direct. It's an entirely another conversation. For the direct, from an investor perspective, when a company receives, for example, a grant from the Strategic Investment Fund, which is one of the Canadian vehicles, that to an investor is seen as an extension of company lifetime and runway, but it is not seen as product traction. Whereas when a company receives a contract from any piece of the government, whether it's through the IDEAS program or the ISC program, that is seen as a buyer. And that buyer is going to take that product on board and test it and give some feedback. So the ratio is almost 5-to-1, maybe 10-to-1 in value between a contract that is purchasing a product and a grant, which is extending the lifetime or the lifeline of the company. And one thing that I took from all of that time in the United States was the United States has really done a good job of building their contracting mechanism, which, as Kauser mentioned, through things like the SBIR program, it's not giving money to the companies, it's asking the companies to solve a problem. And whether the company chooses to solve that problem or not, when they finally do, they're getting somebody to buy their product and they're getting feedback on how the product worked. And that is much more valuable than to an investor. It shows market traction. It shows the company climbing the technology curve. And it's much more valuable than either a grant or an R&D tax credit like the SR&ED. I don't want to say SR&ED is not useful. It's very useful. It does attract companies to Canada. It's a very favorable tax regime, but there's nothing like product sales.
Alicia, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to first totally endorse what you're saying, Duncan, and draw what I think is a little bit of nuance, particularly for those who are not familiar with the SBIR program, that it comes in 3 phases, right? So 2 of those phases are grants, and the third one being a contract. If you're successful, they are mission driven, and they do go around. The leaders of SBIR do go around to the heads of the large government research labs and departments, and say, Department of Energy, what are your issues 10 years from now, 5 years from now, but longer term strategic issues. But the first thing is a grant, $100,000 or so, and the second thing, is a proof of product, but again, it's a grant for maybe $1.5 million, and the last one is a contract. And I think having those, having both is super important. I also totally agree with the IDEAS program and the Innovation Solutions Canada being really important aspects of our ecosystem. But as you had said earlier, I would say, compared to proportional funding, proportional to population in the US, our programs are very small compared to the SBIR. And so, maybe to the question that was raised about indirect versus direct funding of this space, I think maybe our balance is too far, as the Naylor report pointed out several years ago, that our balance is too far over to the indirect SR&ED program versus the direct. And I would love to see the direct grow.
ISC and IDEAS, they start out with that same $100,000 range for phase 1, and then it goes to $1 million range for phase 2, which is fantastic for a startup company of 5 people. But it doesn't really mean anything to a startup company of 100 people. For example, our first investment as a fund was Xanadu Quantum Computing in Toronto. That was a $100 million round. So for them to connect with ISC and get $1 million contract, it doesn't really mean that much. They're focused on much bigger things. And we currently in Canada have almost no pathway after we get to this sort of the 5-person scale. We have no pathway to get towards a $5 or $10 million. We flip towards the SIF program at that point. But again, the SIF program isn't really a product procurement. So then we're back in the catch-22 of not really encouraging those startups, those high growth startups, in the way that they need.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I wanted to jump in here, a couple of things. So Jeff Kinder, he asked, someone mentioned about the SR&ED could be repurposed for big, say, societal challenges. That's a good question. What comes to mind are things like the climate change, the call to address climate change. We see it, speech from the throne. It's definitely a government priority. And that has a manifestation in the high-tech industry, some very high-level science and engineering that has to be done there. And it also, however, has a big drive, big support among the public and society as a whole. And there could be involvement across many sectors, many kinds of technology, many kinds of knowledge. So how do we get the whole system to work together on such an initiative, and how can we put together all the different instruments to move the needle on that? So that's sort of a challenge question, because you could have a particular technology and work on that one, or do this and that, but how do you do a whole one and at the scale that Duncan talks about, and where, of course, Canadian companies would evolve, would emerge from this and be making money, and there would be success economically for the country in all these different aspects. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is, or how much what we are doing currently is moving in that direction.
Kauser, do you have any insight on that as from the entrepreneurial standpoint?
I wanted to actually, yes, thank you. I wanted to pick up some of these comments. And Duncan, one of the last things you said was about this gap. You get companies, 5 or 10 in size, and then how do you support their continued growth? And this is where there's a tremendous opportunity for provincial vision and strategy to really be formulated around this. And we're already seeing this as an example in BC. This year, the NBC Investment Corporation was established and launched with a $500 million investment mandate for Series A and beyond funding. And this is absolutely crucial, because we need to help these companies get beyond the 5 to 10 person stage. And it's a multi-pronged strategy. It's not only an NBC investment, but you need, which is a public investment fund, but you also, of course, need the private investment approaches to come alongside. You need, the direct funding to come alongside when we need the benefit of SHRED. So these multi-pronged approaches to prop up and help establish, and achieve that critical mass is crucial. One of the examples I really like to look at is what the state of Massachusetts did with the life sciences, Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, with a $1 billion mandate over 10 years. And, initially the programs they launched to build up the ecosystem were different than the programs that are currently available. But now you look at that entire ecosystem, it has grown incredibly. And that initial investment strategy was so crucial, and it was very interdisciplinary. It incentivized all the key stakeholders in the ecosystem, academia, private industry, investors, to come together and through the different programs that they created to help make this happen. And so there are plenty of examples that have worked well. There are also examples that have not worked well. And we are constantly learning, evolving, and of course, being able to refine them and implement them, especially on a provincial level.
I just want to tell you, because I love the idea. There's my puppy dog in the background there, you'll get. But I love the idea of acknowledging that investment can have a public interest. And I see that comes, the simplest way humans relate is with each other in a community. We identify with a community. The traditional venture capital model is returns only focused. Then we have the impactor investor model, which is impact focused. And what I see from Kauser, what you're describing is that having that investment, a fund that has a geographic focus, it actually has the long-term interest of that community at heart. So it can make decisions which are informed by the local strengths and the local needs of that community. And it can make decisions which I would argue maybe can do a little bit better job of balancing a pure financial return, which the community still wants, with what I would say would be returns outside of the circle of the pure finance for the company, but are absolutely returns to that community. And we sometimes get caught up with, well, if I'm not getting $1 paid back or $10 paid back for my investment, I can't do it. And that is actually correct in the environment of some of the venture capital world, but it's not necessarily true as soon as you broaden your thinking a little bit. And that's true of the university as well. I mean, if a university pressures the technology transfer office to get a return, then you need to scratch your head a little bit and say, if the benefits don't land exactly in the technology transfer office, but land in the city or community of Vancouver or Winnipeg or something, then don't we still win? And it's only when you broaden your thinking a little bit to that larger perspective. And indeed, I would argue that's the raison d'etre for the Business Development Bank of Canada, after all. So
I love that. And I'm going to keep this conversation going as long as I can, but I want to also include the audience. We've had a couple of really great questions, but please, if you've got questions for our panelists, put them into the live Q&A chat. And for the panelists, if you have questions for each other, which you've been great at picking up on, feel free to talk about those as well. So there's so many pieces in here, as well as like the humanity that needs to go into this system and this system's approach. While we look to see for more Q&A, I thought I'd come back to the talent creation part again. Because Alicia, you gave a number of questions that we needed to address and possibilities, but we didn't actually go and address those possibilities. And there was this comment about commercialization postdocs, which is quite a departure from what postdocs currently do. So do you mind speaking about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Sarah, and I'd welcome my colleagues' input on this as well. Earlier in the panel, we can learn from other ecosystems that have trialed things that have worked well in this space. And one of them I think to learn from is the cyclotron road example out of University of California, Berkeley. And now Elon Gur, who started that program, has also started a company, Activate, which is doing some programs in Boston, the Massachusetts area, and also in New York. That is trying, it's focused around a commercialization postdoc program. And it's also trying to make sure those links are there for deep tech ventures to be able to access government research labs and university scientists and mentors. So it brings postdocs in for 2 years, usually straight out of their PhD, and having researched on a deep tech area, having an invention that is in this space we're talking about, maybe quantum computing, maybe sustainable energy, something for the clean energy transition, green hydrogen production process, or a carbon capture and storage, maybe something that is around personalized medicine therapeutics. But bringing them in for 2 years, giving them a socialization that they don't yet have to decide if they're leaving academia for good, because they're in a program that looks a lot like a normal postdoc, but then making sure that the major criteria for success and the expectations of their supervisor and program is that they try to de-risk the technology that they've developed in their PhD. So they're getting a mindset, there's an educational component. There could be packed into that and something to do with IP and IP vouchers, or the technology vouchers, or access to university facilities and government facilities. But it's really giving stability to HQP for 2 years to be able to try to take the first steps to see if they have something that could become a new science-based venture, or if they have something that they can de-risk to the point that industry could take it up now. So I'd be curious. I think that, and we've had a few examples in Canada. I know there's an experiment going on right now in Concordia with this program, and I know that in Alberta, the Green STEM program has been a postdoc program that there's been experiments with. But I'm interested in my colleagues' perspectives on the usefulness of such a program in Canada.
Kauser, we're waiting for Kauser.
So I was waiting for Alejandro, but no worries. Somebody mentioned the MARS program. And one of the things I really like about the MARS program is the breadth and scale at which it is operating and the kind of impact that it's having. And I see what you are describing, Alicia. Sorry, did you have a comment?
Just to clarify, I think you're talking about the Mars and NRCan Women in Clean Tech Challenge, the one where is that the program that you're talking about with Mars?
No, this is the one that's supporting over 1,400 Canadian science and tech companies based out of Toronto area.
Oh, yeah, the overall Mars, as opposed to
yes,
just
yes,
okay, yes, fair enough.
Yes, but I also wanted to address your comment as well. We do need programs that allow students, postdocs, researchers within the academic environment to be able to dive deeper into these topics. Universities have a fiduciary responsibility to provide the safe space for students and postdocs to be able to develop these skills, while at the same time not having to take on extreme risk about their career development pathway. And this is a challenge because the metrics that we use for these professional development pathways, numbers of papers published, grant funding secured, often don't allow the kind of risk taking that you need for some of the entrepreneurial activities. And so there needs to be a balance, a more balanced way to manage this and simultaneously encouraging it both ways. We tend to follow or do what gets modeled for us. And if you're a student going through an undergraduate program or graduate program, the most common thing that's modeled for you is the academic pathway, which is extremely important. But we need to more actively supplement that. We need to, or complement that with other models, that there are pathways to go down, whether it is an entrepreneurship pathway or whether it's an industrial pathway, that take a more applied R&D and commercialization focus, and bring together the opportunity to learn and go down and develop a career pathway in those avenues. And so I completely agree. We do need more of these, and we need to continue to invest in them. We have active programs that are starting to do this already and have been doing this, and we should absolutely move forward in that direction.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that. So I agree very much with what has been said. The postdocs as we know them were fashioned not so long ago, and they were created to perpetuate the system that was known then. And there are many things that can be done to improve those positions and to create streams which accomplish what we want to do. So, for example, there's a lot of teaching of how to teach, for example, in young people. That's a great thing that you're doing for our students in graduate school if they are going to become professors. But what about having them take an entrepreneurship course? What about having them then streaming towards these commercialization postdocs where they have that minimal security, but also the idea of risk-taking is built in? So I would pose that just as we do something for the academic stream, which is what our efforts have been, we could also do this for this commercialization idea. And I do know some of these pilots or suggested mechanisms have had some very promising results. And that's something that should be on the table when we talk about the overall training of the next generation. And that's something where when I talk to young people, in my visits, in this case, virtual visits to different universities, a lot of anxiety among the young people. What's going to happen? What's going to happen with my degree? Am I going to get a tenure track job eventually or not? And it really shouldn't be about that. It really should be about how we can mobilize what they've learned, the methodology they have to accomplish something for Canada and for themselves. And it doesn't have to be a teaching job. It can be many other things.
I love that idea.
It might be useful to observe that the academic system has matured in the last 50 or 100 years, and where a PhD even 50 years ago was relatively rare, it's actually much more common. And thankfully, Canada actually is a very highly educated society, which fuels our research excellence. At the same time, it might be useful to observe that only 10 or 15% of our current PhD cohort and that's after you've taken away all the undergrads and master's people who have already gone, it's only 10 to 15% of that cohort that actually continue to academe. And those tend to be very scientifically talented people who are highly motivated to continue that path. But what about the 85% that have this advanced degree, have all of this technical expertise, and yet, as Kauser suggested, one of the primary models that we're holding up is the academic path, which obviously 85% of them are not going to take. When I look at some of the more recently high growth areas in Canada, for example, the Waterloo or Toronto area, I think the example of success and the role model that success brings allows even those PhD students to see, hey, wait a minute, my PhD is valuable. Yes, if I am very motivated, I can continue in academia. But if not, if that's not what I want, I can put all of my training to really good use in this sort of deep tech space. And this idea of Alicia of postdocs that would support that very strongly encourage that. One twist on that might be I'm keen on seeing the company sort of drive that, even if it's just a startup of a few people, rather than the academic institution. Because as we go back to the previous conversation, that tends to focus on getting the problem solved or getting the technology developed.
Speaking of getting the problem solved, I do not want to interrupt this conversation, but I did promise someone in the discussion that we would answer one of their questions. And this one is flipping from training to industry. So this is a big question. Is Canadian demand for innovation a big factor in the supply of Canadian innovation, or are the suppliers of innovation tending to be more focused on serving markets elsewhere? And this Kavan also says that there are many unmet needs within Canada, rural communities. And someone just went underneath that, so I lost it. But essentially, that there are other places in Canada that may not have necessarily the same market pull, but have significant need. And what are we doing to address that, and how can we address that? So multi-pronged question. Does anyone want to take that first? Alejandro.
Being so close to the US, right? A lot of the people that we train and a lot of the innovation naturally filters to the US. Even when students are applying for jobs, even academic students, the US job market dominates in some sense. And I would argue it's probably easier to get a job in the US academic circles than to get a job in Canada if you're graduating from a Canadian university. So obviously the innovation is, and we are fulfilling a worldwide goal. I don't know what the answer is in terms of keeping it national versus participating globally, because Canada is a big global player, and sometimes we lose sight of that.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Alicia, you want to add to that? Yep.
I think I would want to reframe the question slightly about the demand for innovation. I see it as we have huge local, regional, and global problems. These problems require creative, innovative solutions. And fortunately, a country like Canada has a highly educated population because there's been this wonderful and continues to be deep investment in education. So we are driven to solve a lot of these problems. We have to solve them. We are, just this past week, the natural disaster in British Columbia from the atmospheric river and the rains, the climate issues that we're facing. We're also very cognizant of where these problems are headed. At the same time, we are the basic research, the fundamental research is identifying all kinds of new knowledge. And it's the intersection of these problems and the applications of this knowledge that's creating opportunities. So what we're doing is we are training up the current and next generation to take advantage of the intersection of these opportunities. And this is happening everywhere. This is happening all across the world. I think one of the challenges that we need to think about, and this is raised in some of the questions, is how do we help and apply and incentivize more of this locally as well? There are underserved communities here that we are all very aware of. And so we need more efforts on that focus as well, and not lose that focus, not lose focus of that. And there's naturally going to be workforce is traveling all the time now. The world is smaller, and we're competing for talent from all over, and we're competing for opportunities. And so, our political leadership has a responsibility to create the ecosystem environment for a competitive landscape for people to remain here, to people to be attracted and recruited here, in a manner that allows us to grow the economy and create opportunities and to solve some of the very local, regional problems that we have. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here, and I agree with the other comments that were made on this as well.
Kauser, I really want to, your description really resonates with me, obviously. And one thing I want to pick up there is that I completely agree that, for example, if we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, every single one of those 17 goals is embodied locally in Canada in a number of different environments. There's just no question about it. Now, if the only thing we do is seek to solve that local problem, and I think we need to acknowledge that context really does matter. So the solution to flooding in BC might not be the same as solution to flooding in East Africa or something like that. But the core pieces will actually be similar. And if you set about tackling that solution in British Columbia with an eye towards how that same sustainability problem manifests in different places in the world, then you have, I think, this intersection that you talked about, which is the recipe for not only solving the Canadian problem, but building a private sector enterprise that can scale to large size and solve similar incarnations of that problem in other places in the world. And that's a recipe I am a huge proponent of.
And I just want to build further on that, because I fully agree with the things my colleagues have said here. But I would say that to do that, to allow that balance, local and global problems of being able to get started with an initial market that you're supported in, and also keep open the potential and the real option, if you will, of creating and capturing value globally from that solution and solving problems globally. IP strategy is really important, as is the early stage market prioritization and commercialization strategy for this research coming out of these labs. So thinking about those issues early, resourcing those issues, and aligning incentives of the key actors, including the scientists, the PIs, and the HQP in their lab, in order to enable them to do so. And one last point on that is, I think it's underappreciated the value of the international research collaborations that our PIs and their labs have in order to be able to really help that venture sell internationally and have endorsement internationally. But again, we need to support, and we need to have that PI staying with the venture in some role and not be penalized for doing so, in order to unlock that value for locally, regionally, nationally, and globally.
Absolutely. Speaking of the power of the researcher, Alejandro, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
That's very eloquent, and all of my three colleagues have been very eloquent about that. And the fact is, we are in a globalized world, but we all live locally, and we have to really the consequences of our actions and the impact, and how we can be smart about creating stickiness locally for the kind of talent, so that they at the same time see the impact of their work in this global forum where it's more visible. So those are very interesting, very important challenges. And that's why universities that have ties to the local community, like SFU, that knows the innovation community in British Columbia, play such an important role in creating that stickiness and that cohesion between the regional and the global. Absolutely.
I love that idea of local stickiness, global impact. I could keep going with this conversation all day, but as we have had this conversation, we've also seen this beautiful collection of thoughts emerging from Kristen. And so I'm going to turn it over to her to summarize some of what she's heard.
Hi, thank you so much. What everyone will see here on the screen is the visualization that I've been capturing during the discussion today. We started learning about why research innovation is so important, understanding the economic impacts, as well as just thinking about the ecosystem. So starting in the lab and understanding how that impacts in other markets locally and globally. We chatted about myths and different barriers there are to innovation. Many of those were cultural. A good example was the innovation garage myth. The question about how much risk and uncertainty there's a willingness to take, and certainly there are some Canadians that are risk takers in the field. We heard also about the importance of creating bridges and that entrepreneurial capabilities can be taught. And then we learned quite a bit about growing the ecosystem here, that there needs to be more building blocks. A lot of these were related to how investment is provided for students and postdocs and PhDs, as well as faculty. Different ways that the university can approach funding and different programs that are currently in place as well. And also the need for IP strategy and making this an eligible expense on more programs. We also heard about the different model pathways that could be shown to students as they're involved in the university, not just looking at tenure and teaching opportunities, but entrepreneurship, being in deep tech, commercialization, and things like that. And overall, it sounded like a lot of what we were talking about today really has to do with solving problems here, thinking about whether or not those can be scaled globally, and how our institutions and universities can really be training to take advantage of those opportunities and solve those problems. Thank you.
What a fantastic summary, and I look forward to looking back on that image to remember this fantastic conversation. And I appreciate how useful this conversation is as far as identifying problems, but also coming up with actionable solutions. And thank you, Kristen, for doing such a great job of summing up what some of those solutions can be. One of the last things that I just wanted to add was, one of the themes that I saw in this conversation was that we need not to be thinking in black and white or siloed terms. And we talked about the importance of not saying we all just have to do applied research, but basic research and applied research. That we need not just more companies, but more companies and more people who will work in those companies and the scientists who will create the research to solve the problems that spawn those companies and solve those global problems. And investors that understand entire continuums and particularly looking at one of the myths that Kristen touched on and that was brought up right at the beginning was that, we have to create a whole new system. That was the myth. And in fact, we have a fantastic system. We have incredible outputs or incredible inputs, but it's a more nuanced understanding of the actors and changing up where those and solidifying and strengthening all of those connections that can really unleash this potential that we have in the Canadian innovation ecosystem to solve those Canadian problems that are also global problems, taking that long-term mission-driven approach. And so I hope that everyone has taken away the same level of inspiration and determination to be a force for that positive change from this panel. And I wanted to finish by just saying a humongous thank you to all of the panelists who have provided such fantastic insight and have really provided an example of the kind of ecosystem and collaboration between players that we want to see. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today, for all of your insights. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined us for this session. We hope that you will take away some of those actions as well. So with that, thank you, everyone.